This is a 1941 recording of a man born in 1843 who was an official photographer for the United States Geological Survey, the USGS.
It was 75 years ago, way back in 1866, that he worked his way west on the Oregon Trail as a bullwhacker. He was the first man who ever took pictures in the Yellowstone country. With his camera and with his able brush, he has photographed and painted a record of our early West that would not exist otherwise. He went as a bullwhacker with the Mormons to Salt Lake. He was with a mule freight outfit that lugged stuff over the mountains to a little village called Los Angeles.
They make it sound like Los Angeles was just a campsite at the time. No. It was much more. You'll see these photos he didn't take.
He was with a mule freight outfit that lugged stuff over the mountains to a little village called Los Angeles. To a little village called Los Angeles. To a little village called Los Angeles. This man had the eye of an artist and the instinct of a historian. We have a better understanding today of the beginning of our Great West. Much of the development of the West was aided by his work. And now we're very happy, Mr. Jackson, that you're here with us now and can tell us in your own words some of these things that I know you would like to have us know.
It's my opinion that the interviewer is asking somewhat leading questions. Of course, he probably thinks he knows.
Well, do you remember how the cowboys handled their trail herds in the great cattle drives between Texas and Montana?
I am now engaged in painting a picture covering that very subject, showing the big drive of the old Longhorn period up across the old Chisholm Trail into Wyoming.
That's as you remembered.
Yes. I only crossed the trail. I didn't follow it.
I see.
It's interesting to see what is actually spoken by the man being interviewed, because he doesn't always seem to follow the narrative that's put forth, at least by the host or interviewer.
Now, did you actually see any of these old range wars that took place?
No, I never. The Johnson County War, as they call it, in Wyoming, that country, was a little bit out of my territory.
So you can see that even he had to deal with privation, and the idea of the wars being something that so many people saw. Again, it's not the case. The actual fighting battles, there aren't a lot of accounts.
We were up in the mountains more. My work with the Geological Survey was almost entirely in the mountains.
So they kept him on a course on these mountains, this famous trail that so many people had been on. Here's the premier photographer, and you would think that he would use these trails that are trampled down and protected and known just to get from place to place in order to make the photographs. Apparently, he only crossed across the trail. He wasn't on it. I think it was only military militias and things like that.
Entirely in the mountains.
Well, now, was there water in the streams in those days?
Oh, yes, but not much. Water was not conserved then. There were dry seasons when the streams almost go dry. But, of course, at that time, early day, there's no irrigation, except in a very small way.
There's a part I edited out where he talks about millions or hundreds of thousands of buffalo in one giant herd in the plains. Well, how could they drink? There are no streams. If they ran dry, how could the buffalo drink unless the irrigation was already in place? That's where the buffalo came from. And when he talks about the hunting, I think that's a tale too. That's a hoax, that they didn't hunt and kill the buffalo like that. They just died off, probably from thirst, probably because the irrigation of the former civilization that was in place had kept those buffalo as cattle, and they were abundant. And when that civilization was wiped out, the irrigation wasn't maintained. The dams may have been there. Some of the dams may have already been there, and many of them that were there may have been broken in order to flood the West. And the buffalo, the cattle that survived from the livestock, from the agriculture of the people who were wiped out, that they just kind of gathered. It's just one of the last signs or remnants of what once was, just that the cattle survived when the people didn't. And they finally died off, not from predation or hunting, but from thirst.
so that they confined themselves to immediate vicinity of the water.
But there was no
They didn't
dust
depend upon
blowing.
rainfall at all. They did depend for such crops as they had upon irrigation, but in a limited way.
Well, what did people do for amusement in those days? What were their amusements?
Oh, I don't know. There's no amusement such as we know it today. They all went to bed early and got up early.
I see. What about the social life?
Oh, the social life is occasional gathering of all people for a dance, like the old-fashioned barn dance. All the ranchmen had their dancing night. That is the great amusement, I might say.
I think they had better entertainment. And also, this is interesting about the way they earn money. Of course, most everybody out there earned money from the government.
Oh, and the overland stage lines were running by raising hay and such things for the service of the Pony Express and the overland stage and things of that kind.
They really always pushed wheatgrass as a product.
And of course, that's one of the pushed products, you might say, was that, of course, when the Mormons went in there, they began at once with the wheat crop. On the first year of their entrance into Salt Lake Valley, they had a wheat crop growing at once.
Here's another instance where it's let slip that an area, a whole built-up area, is opened up. So they said it's opened up for the Mormons, and they whoosh in, swoop in, and have wheat and corn crop right away because the irrigation's in place.
By sowing the wheat and corn, I should say, besides the wheat. But I've always called the most interesting period of my life, the 10 years I spent in the West with the Hayden Survey. That's always been my most interesting period. New things to saw, new places to photograph, first things to bring to the attention of the world.
I find his answer quite fascinating because you'll hear in a little bit how he traveled around the world in 18 months photographing for a weekly magazine, and that is something else, I would say, beyond just the West and nature.
To make the Yellowstone region known, to make the mountain, the Holy Cross known to the people, to make known to people the cliff dwellings of the South. All very interesting things in themselves, but no one startling, dramatic, single incident, you might say.
Well, now in this next section, he's going to talk about who was there first, or if he was the first, and he's a little careful about it, but he kind of lets loose that anything that is for the public to know or in the public image or public knowledge, because really you look at all this stuff that he does in the photographs he took, it's literally of the landmarks and areas that became national parks later and unchanged. Of course, ostensibly they didn't know that at the time, that it would be preserved, but what he photographed is nothing special much compared to what you can see today, other than the very few photographs of urban areas and groups of people that he took, which is strangely absent, and it's talked about here later on that it's almost forbidden, or he's instructed not to take photos of anything other than natural landscapes. No people, no structures. Very clear about that.
You have probably been the first man to have looked upon, or the first white man at any rate, to have looked upon many of those natural wonders out there, have you not been?
Well, in a way, not the first to look upon them so much as to perpetuate them in pictures. Pretty hard to say in this America of ours where a man has not been.
Well, that's true,
But
too.
we're among the first people to follow on the tails of those unnamed people, trappers and people of that kind, who may have seen these things. But we were the first to make them publicly known.
They use this word known to make it known, or to let you know, or make you know, and actually you don't know. What do you know? You just heard.
Well, what were some of those things that you made known for the first time to the rest of the country?
Yellowstone, Holy Cross, the cliff dwelling, the main Rocky Mountain chain of peaks, Fremont's Peak, and all those big, the Teton Mountains, all those prominent features today in the scenic wonders of the West.
I have seen some of those pictures you've made, Mr. Jackson, made on the tops of mountains, where you knew that it must have been tremendously difficult just to get to the point and carrying
That was the main
equipment that
part
you
of
had.
my experience with the Hayden survey.
And therefore, many of the photos would be almost identical to today, other than a few towers and power lines and highways or something that may be visible.
In those days out there, you've photographed many people, have you not, who've been a part of our West, of our early history?
We didn't photograph many people, many groups. We were rather limited on that account. We were outfitted for just about so much work. We couldn't carry only a fixed quantity of glass, because that is heavy. We generally had, as I might say, for a season's work, about 400 glass plates. And we were intent upon the scenery. We didn't care about our own party. Didn't care about what they did themselves individually. We were interested in what they saw, new places, things of that kind. And towards the end of the season, if there were still things to be photographed that had not been taken, well, we'd wash off from the old group picture and use them for scenery. Of course, the scenery remained, but those people had passed.
In other words, at the end of the season, at the end of the survey trip, any group photos or photos of people or photos of the city or anything like that, whoever was in charge would have them wash off, basically destroy that evidence and replace it with more scenery.
Much to my regret in some cases.
You must have known and been acquainted, at any rate, with a lot of those characters of the early West, were you not?
They were not prominent in those days. We didn't think much of them. Then building westward, photographed that road from one end to the other. That brought me in contact with Dr. Hayden, who was then running a survey of the Western Territory. He liked my work so well and thought it should be an important part of his own work, and he induced me to join the survey. I gave up my business in Omaha as a local photographer, and for the next 9 years including, I worked with the survey and engine and all that, and during the next 15 or 20 years, my work was almost entirely in following up the development of the Western Railroad. During that period, of course, I made a great many pictures for exhibitions, particularly for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, '93. After that, I prepared a series of pictures over the Baltimore, Ohio Road that I had made the previous year. The publicity agent of that road, after the completion of that work, he conceived the idea of taking me around the world with the Transportation Commission, so-called. So in the latter part of '94, with a party of 5, we started abroad and spent the next 18 months going all over eastern continent, from all the way from England over to the far points of the Far East, down to Australia and the Philippines and the Japan, and finally to Vladivostok on the Pacific, and returned from there overland by sledge in the wintertime, making a 3,000-mile trip over the snowy roads of eastern Siberia, photographing all the way. Those pictures, by the way, being published in Harper's Weekly during that period, weekly in all the issues of that paper during the latter part of '95 and '96. That was one of my longest trips of that kind, because we took the whole route from Vladivostok to Moscow in covering that trip in that year. Returning from that to New York, we came back in the Depression period of the late 90s, and that kind of threw me out of business, until finally I joined in with a color printing concern and went to Detroit in '98, and for the next 25 years I engaged in color printing business, converting these photographs largely into color views, postcards largely. We turned out millions and millions of postcards, using all my old negatives made during the previous 40-odd years.
I understand that you're the father of the postcard, Mr. Jackson.
Well, that is a far-fetched assumption, I think.
Origin as anyone else
Yeah,
can say.
but I don't know any picture being used for that purpose before that time. The little picture cards made different sizes and so on, but not the size of an envelope as a picture card as we know them today. And that brings me back here again after these 75-odd years to sojourn again with the explorers of today, Explorers Club and the Geological Survey and various allied organizations of that kind. My life has been devoted to picturizing the West. When I gave up photography, and with the old processes, I took the pencil and the paintbrush, and I've preserved many mementos of the old trail in that way.
Now, at this point, you're going to hear him kind of switch over. He just kind of went off script a little bit, and then now there may have been a cut that isn't noticeable, but here he's being prompted. It seems like he's reading a pre-prepared statement, maybe one he didn't write, but the official narrative, as it were.
Yes, go right ahead, Mr. Jackson.
Well, for the last 15 years, since I retired from active business, I've been more active than ever in carrying on the story of the Old West. That's been largely in connection with the work of the Oregon Trail Association, covering my original route across the continent, as well as picturizing it now for future records of the Old West. Because I bring to it not only my original work in sketches and so forth, but the memory of all those things which are still fresh in mind, and able to carry on the old story by picture and other means of that kind. It's been a great pleasure to meet the boys of the Geological Survey here. I come here pretty nearly annually, although my home is now in New York, but I keep alive the old story, and from here I go west every year, still following the old trails, from the Missouri River to the coast, as we call it, by foot and airplane and motor car and every imaginable way you can think of. I've covered, I think, pretty nearly every way of traveling across the continent.